start, okay?
Great.
Okay, I'd like to begin. It is my pleasure to introduce Dave today. This is a very auspicious day to have Dave reach this stage of his academic trajectory. Dave, as many of you know, received a bachelor's degree in applied physics from Caltech, and then was a wandering yogi, among other things, for a chunk of time, and then decided to return to the academy, and he began his graduate studies here in 2006, and has had an illustrious journey. And he has been involved in many different things in our lab and our center. He is a scientist with really an extraordinary range of talent, a very, very deep curiosity about the nature of the mind and how it works and how we can use that information that we glean from science to actually promote human flourishing. He has been involved in a number of projects about which you will not hear today. And what you will hear about today is a series of studies that were launched relatively late in his graduate career that a go at it just among ourselves. So, Dave.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. It's nice to be here in the room where we have lab meeting because it feels very familiar. It's definitely a different crowd than what I'm used to, so that's kind of fun. The title of the talk is Are You the Same? The Impermanent Self in Body and Mind. Richie has hinted at this on a number of occasions. This was the version of the phrasing that he used at the department Ph.D. reception. I've had a journey through graduate school with many turns, a wide range of interests, a lot of different projects, like Richie said. And as he said, I'm only going to be talking about the work from the last few years, but what I am going to do is just give you a very quick walk down memory lane, a little bit of nostalgia, just because it'll be fun and because it also does actually show that there's a bit of a, I'm not sure I'm going to go so far to say method to the madness, but there's definitely a logical thread that connects some of these things from beginning to end. So, like many of my current colleagues, before I came here, I was entranced by all these amazing stories out of Richie's lab and this unique work happening here, Tibetan monks and the brain scanner, electrodes, all this kind of stuff. I mean, it was just amazing for someone like me with my kind of interest. And I kind of thought, this is really where I want to be because among other things, I would meet other people with similar interests. And when I got here, it was right in the middle of everything. It was the big push for data collection on that project. There were film crews, and Mingyur Rinpoche was here, and other Tibetan meditators. You can see Antoine there, and sort of me pretending I'm helping put someone into the scanner. There's the Mind and Life community was sort of the larger community of contemplative neuroscience. There's these Mind and Life conferences, which were where I got to meet the wider range of people with similar interests, the whole contemplative science community all over. There was a lot of fun and camaraderie. You can also see John Dunn in the upper left picture, who's looking way more attentive than I am in that picture. But indeed, I was waiting for a chance to ask a very, very important question, which I probably didn't. Back home in the lab, there was a lot of camaraderie. This is some of my, there's no room for me to put pictures of all my favorite people, but I was kind of amazed that I actually found a picture of a bunch of people from my cohort without needing to hire an archaeologist. But you can actually see some of the people in the upper left corner that I entered this class with. I found that old picture of me and Hajina. I just couldn't resist. And down in the bottom there's Michael Enderle eating a knitted hamburger that he has still in his office right now. This is Java Kristen Javeris, who any one of you who were here when she was here, you'll have a lot of memories of her. She was quite a strong presence in the lab for a while. There are also a lot of wacky hijinks. I'm not going to necessarily explain the stories of all these pictures, but the people who were involved know what these things were. David Bachhuber is, he has nostrils like no one else. I don't know. Anyway, one of the longest turns in this process was this super interesting project where I went to India repeatedly to do a research project where we were putting EEG electrodes on people out there, training a team to run the project. I had to learn a lot about managing a remote team, travel and stuff like that. Me and Antoine had to be the men in black for a little while. It really was that kind of secretive cloak and dagger kind of thing. It was very personally meaningful to me just because of my own interest in Buddhism and my ability to go and visit. Just important, like you can see there's an important pilgrimage site at the top where me and Andy are obviously taking it very seriously, taking that statue very seriously by trying to emulate the facial expression. I don't know what Paul Ekman would have said about that statue. So meanwhile, back home in the lab, I worked on brain imaging in expert and novice meditators. For a while, my main focus, I just glossed over a lot right there, but for a while my main focus was on what we call the NCAM2 pain protocol, which I helped design and run. I wrote and published a paper on the self-reported pain experience of expert meditators, and I did a lot of work on the fMRI data. I saw a lot of really interesting effects in the data, but it seemed like there was a key factor that I needed to find to make sense out of how they all fit together. So because of my own positive experiences with meditation, to be honest, I came in here with a lot of kind of naive expectations about how science was going to work. I started with a simplistic expectation that any experiment I did, meditation would clearly show strong effects on every positive outcome measure. It would just be piece of cake, open and shut. But it turned out that usually data are more complex than that. For example, this was a slide that I presented at a data blitz in 2012. I had expected that the long-term meditators would show a strong group effect where they had lower brain activation than novices with no meditation experience. And what instead I was seeing was that at one particular epoch, late a while after the stimulation, I was seeing a little bit more activation. Not a lot, but just a little bit. And I just was really racking my brain to figure out what's the story that draws all this all together. Unfortunately, I don't have time to explain why that makes sense, but maybe during the question and answer session. So another thing I learned was there was a lot of talk going on about HEP, the Health Enhancement Program, which was developed here as an active control for mindfulness. It was a very well-designed, very effective health enhancement intervention program. It was designed to be perfectly matched with MBSR and to control for all the factors other than mindfulness so we could isolate the unique effects of mindfulness. And it worked really well. In fact, it worked so well that it was just as good as MBSR on most measures. These are two papers that were published on that topic. They're not my papers, so I'm going to avoid going into too much detail, although I will point out that this very recent paper by Simon here, he's pointing out that one of the measures that HEP and MBSR are equally good at is, in fact, mindfulness itself, which gave him the opportunity to write a really interesting paper looking into what's going on there. So this question of what's the key factor to tie all this stuff together kicked around in the back of my mind over the years. In the meanwhile, I had coursework as a grad student. I took a bunch of clinical psych classes with Lynn Abramson, which was very important to me. She's on my committee now because of how much she influenced my thinking about everything. I learned about cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive models of psychopathology, and we spent a lot of time talking about meditation and CBT theory. Also, experimental design, experimental methods in clinical psychology, how you do construct validation and nomological networks, which is an important theme for when I get to the data. And then the other thing that I was spending a lot of time thinking about in my coursework was behavioral and neuroeconomics with Rick Jennison, who's also on my committee because of how much he influenced my thinking. I presented, to give you an idea of how much I was focused on that, I presented a poster at the Neuroeconomics Conference in 2012. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I am going to focus in on a little bit of text that I wrote here because it's leading into what we're doing now. I wrote, the effects of meditation may be mediated by changes in cognitive processes related to the perception and cognition of the self. We have begun to implement a research protocol that will gather data using several variations on the paradigm that was in that poster, specifically an economic decision paradigm, and also measures of self-related cognitive processing. And that is what I have been doing basically since 2012. So the big question became, what exactly are these measures of self-related cognitive processing? What does that even mean, actually? How can I operationalize, even tentatively operationalize, self-related cognitive processing? So while I was thinking about all this stuff, I started to put together the research team that was going to help me with everything. Rick is not here because he's home with his family in Texas, where he lives now, but Andy and Sarah are both here. Andy's still in the lab, and Sarah, thank you for coming to watch. The project was called ECWEL. Here's one point where a later iteration of the research team texted me from, they were out at a bar after a long, hard day of data collection. They're making the ECWEL gang sign here, which warmed my heart more than you can imagine. It's not every day you get to think of your research project as being like a gang. I kind of wish I could just spend this whole time talking about all the accomplishments of the students I've worked with, because it makes me so proud. Anyway, so the challenge is, what is self-related cognitive processing, or a bunch of other related terms that come up in the literature and that came up in my own thinking. We talked a lot about self-identification or self-grasping, reification of the self, self-focused attention, the view that the self is enduring and unitary. That last one, I didn't have access to such a precise phrase back when I started this, but it has ended up being very helpful. This is from Court's paper, Court Dahl, who is also a grad student in the lab here now. He has this paper, Reconstructing and Deconstructing the Self, Cognitive Mechanisms in Meditation Practice, and the terminology was very helpful here. This concept was key, the exact words here, because Rick and I were having all these conversations, Rick from the previous slide a little while back. It turned out he didn't know anything about contemplative science. He just was coming from a totally other background. He kept asking me, so what's meditation? I don't understand. Why is that important? Why would you, so you're just sitting there? What's this supposed to do? And it really put me on the spot, because everybody else I would talk to about my scientific ideas was kind of already in the field and was on board with everything. But Rick really just challenged me to be very precise with what I was trying to talk about. And it turned out to be very difficult. And he also said something that ended up being key, where when I got this idea across of the view that the self is an enduring, solid thing, he said, well, why don't you just ask people? Are you the same person you were a second ago, a minute ago, an hour ago? And that turned out to be the Are You the Same scale that we put together based on what he said, and that is the thing that has tied this whole series of studies together. We developed this scale, we brainstormed some questions, and again, I wouldn't have been able to do this if it weren't for what I learned from Lynn. There are 8 domains that we're asking about: emotion, personality, morality, intelligence. The point, actually, the domains aren't important. The important thing is that there's a range of domains, just to sort of create more variance in the way that we're asking people the questions, so this is not too simple. Here's what it actually looks like in practice. We implemented it in Qualtrics, which is the survey collection engine that we use for everything here. So the important thing about it is that because of the straightforwardness of the questions, it has face validity for this concept, this construct of the view that the self is enduring. It doesn't require a lot of complicated interpretation to at least begin to think that maybe it means what it's supposed to mean. That had been one of the challenges that I worked on. It's this kind of abstract question, this sense of solidity of the self or reification or things. What would you measure that's obviously related to that? So just a face valid questionnaire turned out to be a key element for being able to get this project started. I focused on enduring instead of unitary for simplicity because it made the structure of the questions easier. So then the first thing to do was to do psychometric validation of this new questionnaire that we're developing. I collected data on people in the lab, or rather the teams that I showed you pictures of collected data on people in the lab. They came in and did the questionnaire and a series of other tasks. And they came back for test-retest reliability, because that's an important part of psychometric validation. And I also collected data online, did a few different batches. In the end, it amounted to about 277 responses to that questionnaire, which is really useful for doing factor analysis and looking at the structure of how the different components of the scale hold together. You need a larger sample for some of those kinds of analyses. So in the end, we had 51 people who had come into the lab twice. Their wide range of ages is nice, not just college students, 18 to 72. There are more females than males, but I think enough to be workable. And first of all, the test-retest reliability was great. The correlation between time 1 and time 2 was 0.8. Actually, it was the same 0.8 depending on several different measures, whether you use Pearson's correlation or the intra-class correlation coefficient, type 1 or type 3. This is the scree plot from the factor analysis. What you're looking at here is I'm not really interested in a questionnaire that asks a whole bunch of different things. I want a questionnaire that sort of boils down to one critical measurement. So what you see here is that the first dot is really high, and that's the first dimension of the questionnaire, and then it goes way down after that. So this is pretty good for what we want. And Cronbach's alpha is one coefficient that you can calculate to measure how good it is for holding together. And 0.94 is a great value. Hierarchical omega is another stricter criterion, also works out well there. I'm happy to answer questions about that there, but I have to get through a lot of graphs, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining the underlying meanings of those things right now. This is a biplot from the principal components analysis. You can see that I'm not completely sure that the words are big enough here. But so each one of these, morality, personality, emotion, overall self. So those are each of the different dimensions. Blue is past, red is future. So I don't know, I may have gone past the slide too quickly, but the questions say, are you the same person as you were? And then there's a range of times that people can answer. And then it goes through, are you the same person as you will be? And there's a range of times that you can answer. So there's 8 dimensions times past and future, so a total of 16 arrows there, one for each item. And the important thing is that they're all pointing off in the same direction. They're not going off in different directions. So that means that the thing holds together. It's also interesting that for some of them at least, this is totally a sidetrack actually, but like the world ones are right next to each other, the morality ones are right next to each other. So there are actually little differences in how people answer the questions on these different measures, which is something I might look at in the future. In any case, I'm going to reduce the AYTS to a single score, and from here on out I'm just going to talk about the AYTS score. So to validate the AYTS, in addition to looking at test-retest reliability and factor consistency, there's this idea of the nomological network that I mentioned earlier. You want to look at the definition of nomological network is complicated, but it means that it should behave the way you expect it to within a network of related concepts and constructs. So that's what this whole project is all about, actually, on some level, is the nomological network for a measure of solidity of the self. So in this initial study 1, I looked at a few things. There's the implicit theory scales, something that we took from the literature from Carol Dweck. It has questions where some of the questions are phrased in a way that makes them clearly similar, like people are born with a certain amount of intelligence and you can never really change it. So we expected that to overlap somewhat. There are a lot of detailed reasons why the structure of that questionnaire wasn't optimal for what we were looking at, but we did see a significant correlation. There was another one, the interpersonal reactivity index perspective taking, just a questionnaire about people's ability to see someone else's point of view. That was a significant relationship that made sense. If you're not too stuck on your solid sense of self, it should be easier to take someone else's perspective and understand where they're coming from, which is important for empathy and compassion. So we saw those relationships. And then the one that I thought that was the most interesting and most important, there's this other questionnaire called the inclusion of other in the self. It's been around for a long time. It involves sliding these circles. Well, actually in the original version it's old enough that it really predates computers, so they just had these hand-drawn circles. But with the help of Nate and Andy, we made a JavaScript version of it that would interface with the Qualtrics questionnaire, so people can slide the circle distance, and we ask about friend and stranger. We also ask about acquaintance, but that didn't end up being as important for the analysis. So you'll get one value for friend and one value for stranger. Not surprisingly, everybody put the circles closer together for friend than for stranger. It probably would have meant somebody didn't understand the question if they didn't do that. And when you look at the relationship of that with the Are You the Same scale, you don't see a significant relationship with either of those measures. But when you take the difference between friend and stranger, then you see a very strong relationship. Now, the reason this is important is because your sense of solidity of yourself, you may or may not, first of all, you may or may not like people overall. I mean, you might be an introvert. You might just not feel very close to people. You might be an extrovert. But the important thing is, are you making a big distinction between me and mine versus not me and mine? That's the part where the relationship to the self comes in. If you're making a strong distinction between mine and not mine, that's the part where you're starting to talk about the solidity, the unitary nature of the feeling of self. And here we're talking about the social domain, of course. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Here's the statistics in a table here. So the important thing was that that difference was significant, and actually if you compare it with the other numbers, the nice thing is that the variance is, the effect size basically is higher here. So it has a better relationship with this measure of social, still after all this time, it's hard to put these things into words. The strictness of the social boundaries of the self. So let me just take a step back here. There's 3 studies that I did. I did a 3-part study. The Ackwell study had 3 parts. The first one that I just went through was the Are You the Same scale. So that was study 1. But let me just tell you how the studies fit together. I'm going to look at 3 different dimensions of the self, like I was just saying that I started to compare the Are You the Same scale with the social dimension of the self. But there's other dimensions of the self. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that this concept of the self is important. So actually I'm going to take a minute to talk about that. Like I said, I don't know if anyone saw the abstract, but what I wrote in the abstract is that it used to be fairly normal for people to think that the self was just a thing. And there are different ways of thinking about that. And when it came to neuroscience, that would mean that the brain just had a map of your body or your social domain or whatever. Like the brain just had a map, and that's what your model of yourself is, and it just is what it is. But now the view is more that these things are taking place in the form of dynamic processes, where the brain is constantly taking in the information and using it to update its idea of what's going on. And you can actually see this all the time, because whenever you use any kind of tool, like a fork, when you have a fork and you go to eat, you're not spending your whole time thinking, well, my hand is here, But where's the fork? I have to think about, if I move my hand like this, where does the fork go? Like, the fork just becomes an extension of you, and our brains are evolved to do this. Our brains are evolved, which is obviously adaptive, for us at least, for humans, and I think there's reasons, simpler reasons that may not have to do with using tools, why this makes sense for a range of other organisms. But our brains are adapted to update the model of the self for very good reasons. This physical boundaries of the self, it can change very quickly. It can change more profoundly, like in some classic experiments where they would tape monkeys' fingers together and then do brain scans on them and show that the representations of the fingers in the brain changes now that the fingers move differently. Can you guys see this fork? If you can't see the fork, I can make it bigger. So you don't know where the fork is pointing. If it's too long, it actually, see now my brain has to update the model again because I just changed the fork. But pretty quickly, I would be able to eat marshmallows at a fondue like you're supposed to. So anyway, the self is a process. The brain is constantly updating your model of the self in all these different ways. And there are a lot of different ways. So this is a table that I found in a book called Self-Identity After Brain Injury that's just a summary of different neuroscientists and philosophers who've come up with their own different ways of categorizing some of these dimensions. The bodily self, the minimal phenomenal self is one that isn't even on this table. Autobiographical self and narrative self are particularly important because that's what the Are You the Same scale addresses. The narrative or autobiographical self has to do with the contents of memory that form the continuity and uniqueness of self, history and stable characteristics. So it's your identity, it's the story that you're sort of cognitively, linguistically telling yourself, the beliefs that you have about who you are. So when I give you a questionnaire where I say, are you the same person as you were? I'm asking you a question about your beliefs about yourself, so that's something that's addressing the narrative self right there. Now, what I'm hoping for is that these domains are going to be related to each other, because the narrative self is one thing, but there are a lot of other reasons why some of these more low-level representations might be important. So, study 2, I looked at the endowment effect. This is a surprising phenomenon observed by behavioral economists where people value an object that they possess much more than one that they don't. So bear with me for a second here. This is actually really important in its own right. It's gotten a lot of attention. Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics for work that was one of the main inspirations for it. It wasn't entirely about the endowment effect, but it was largely inspired by that. He developed prospect theory, which is an economic model that could explain this in a way that previous economic models of how people value things couldn't. And it's also really interesting to a lot of people because it's at this intersection of psychology and economics. Why do people feel the value of something some way? Why do people subjectively decide this? Economics, up until that point, was really just this very mathematical endeavor with a bunch of equations showing how some idealized mathematical version of a person would value things. So again, the definition of the endowment effect is that people value things more if they own them than if they don't. It's widely replicated in countless studies. It's not a small effect. Usually the value is about twice as much for things that people own than it is for things they don't own. There's an abbreviation I'm going to have to use a lot here, WTA and WTP. So WTA is willingness to accept. That means if you have a thing and I want to buy it from you, how much is it worth to you? So think of WTA as the high value that you have when you own it. And then WTP is willingness to pay. That's the lower value that you don't have when you don't own it. So for example, the classic paradigm for the endowment effect, you have two groups. There's a buying group. How much would you pay for this coffee mug? How much would you pay for this coffee mug? You offer people a coffee mug. And you use a carefully designed bidding procedure to try to get accurate sense of how they value it. The selling group, you give them the mug, and then you use a carefully designed bidding procedure to try to get an accurate sense of how much it's worth to them. And you see that WTA is maybe twice as much as WTP. The one group's average is more than the other group's average. Now, prospect theory, Kahneman and Tversky's work, this Nobel Prize work that I was talking about, the key insight was that people value things relative to their current reference point. Wherever they are now is how people are evaluating. And actually, this is very analogous to ideas of framing effects and things like that that come up in other contexts like social psychology. This is sort of a numerical version of this, which has certain advantages because just in terms of measurement, you can measure these things quantitatively. So this diagram here, people have a reference point, and then the subjective valuation is the vertical axis, and when you lose something, so when your endowment, when the money that you have or whatever, the stuff that you have goes down, your subjective value for that drops steeply, but when you have a gain that's underweighted, your subjective value doesn't go up as steeply. And actually, people, if you Google endowment effect or loss aversion, you'll see these curves, like so many websites, different people have just drawn the same curve over and over again. Another way of phrasing it is that the joy you get from a gain is a gain of $50, if you can read that there. The joy you get from a gain of $50 is not as much as the pain that you feel from the loss of $50. Now, as a general phenomenon, this difference between how you feel about gains and how you feel about losses is called loss aversion, for obvious reasons. So loss aversion just means that losses loom larger than gains. Now, the endowment effect in prospect theory is explained by loss aversion. The story supposedly is simple. If you have a mug and you're selling it, then that's a loss because the mug is going away from you. So you need more money for that because that's worth a lot to you. If you don't have a mug and you're buying it, that's a gain. So the value involved in that isn't as much. And that works out pretty well. But there's also a lot of debate over the role of psychological ownership and physical possession. So you could just model it like that, but then there's a question of how do other psychological factors come into play. So there's a whole lot of publications on that. And some of them focus on the idea of the specific tactic that they take to approach this question is that when you own something, that constitutes an association of the object with yourself. It becomes a part of your map of yourself to know what the things are that you own. You know, this is mine. It's mine. It's related to me. It belongs to me. Study 2 is I'm looking at the role of the self in the endowment effect. I didn't put this in the text in the slides, but I really want to emphasize the importance of this me and mine ownership and control, because one of the key factors in the development of the sense of self is this aspect of agency. Anything that you control, in some sense, gets incorporated into your sense of self. So when you have agency over something, that you own something, that means you control it, which is kind of funny. I just had to make this sidetrack because in computer hacker slang, owning is the phrase that they use to say that you took control of a computer. So people use the word ownership and control interchangeably in some contexts. Anyway, so lots of people have wanted to study the endowment effect, but there's been a methodological problem because if you want to look at individual differences, you'll notice the example I gave you before of the typical way of studying it was between two groups. And it's not immediately obvious how you could get the same people to buy and sell the same mug and figure out how their value is different for the same thing. So Rick and I actually, and Andy, we spent a lot of time sitting around trying to figure out what would be a thing that would make sense and trying to integrate a lot of the other techniques and bidding systems from behavioral economics. And we came up with what I'm calling WISER, the within subject incentive compatible sequential rebidding procedure. Because, you know, it's important to sound smart. So all of those words actually mean something. Like, I could explain what the importance of incentive compatible is. I could go on about this for a long time, but I'm not getting a Ph.D. in economics, so I'm just going to gloss over it a bit. So that was the key thing that we needed to be able to do the classical endowment effect mug procedure, but to do it as an individual differences measure, which is what we needed for the analyses we wanted to do. So then the overall structure of the study was that we would take 3 approaches to loss aversion. There's one with no endowment and no ownership, which is just based on that curve I show you, where you just look at, it's a classic procedure where you have a gamble with a coin flip and you could lose $5 or win $6. So if that lose $5 feels worse than $6 to you, then you'll say no. So you can just measure people's loss aversion without actually buying or selling or mugs or physical objects or anything. You can do this sort of abstract, purely mathematical way of measuring loss aversion. And that's well established in literature. You can also do more of the endowment effect, and you can get around the physical problem, the methodological problem, by using virtual lottery tickets on a computer screen, where you just say, here's a whole bunch of, in this case, orange and purple lottery tickets. You get one deck, so now you own a bunch of orange ones, and then you can see if people find that the orange ones are worth more than the purple ones. The only problem there is that there's no physical ownership, and they don't really mean anything. Even if you did have physical ownership of the lottery tickets, you know you're going to hold on to it for a second, and then you're going to scratch it, and it won't be yours anymore. So that wasn't really satisfying to us. This is a few published papers had looked at the endowment effect that way, but we felt like we could do better. So our wiser procedure is a way of measuring the endowment effect with actual physical goods that people actually physically have in their hands, and when we tell them that they own it, that they're actually holding it, they have it, it's theirs in every real sense. Which is important because of what I was saying of how the brain integrates the sense of self in a lot of ways based on the extent of the body and what you're holding, what you're controlling. So once we have all those things, we could statistically test the physical possession version of the endowment effect to see if it accounts for variance above and beyond the other loss aversion measures. So there's something going on there with the physical aspect of the endowment effect that's related. The hypothesis is that there would be something going on with the physical version of the endowment effect above and beyond these other things, and it would be accounted for by psychological measures, for example, the Are You the Same scale. We also looked at, because it was too obvious to pass up, we looked at the self-extension tendency scale, which is a questionnaire in the literature about associating possessions with your sense of self. We actually found this in the marketing literature, where it was a brand identity thing, where they did this. They were giving people questions about brand identity and whether they felt like they were really a Pepsi person or whatever. And it worked, pretty much. The self-extension tendency scale significantly explains variance in the physical goods endowment effect beyond what is accounted for by loss aversion and other covariates. Also, the same is true for the physical endowment effect controlling for the non-physical endowment effect with the lottery tickets. So the lottery tickets and then the plain old mathematical loss aversion go together really well. But then with the physical goods, there was something else going on above and beyond that. And also with the Are You the Same scale. Now I know somebody's going to ask, so there's like a super crazy outlier there, but when I take that out, it makes it slightly less significant, but it doesn't really change it. It's not super influential because it's in the middle there. So now I have 2 parts together in this 3-part study. Study 1 is the Are You the Same scale, which looks at the narrative self. Study 2 looks at the self from the perspective of ownership or agency. And now on to study 3. So study 3 is on the rubber hand illusion. Yeah, so one of the big challenges I've had here is in putting together this talk is that there's this kind of whipsaw because it's interdisciplinary. And first I'm trying to tell you about nomological networks and questionnaire development, and then I'm trying to tell you about economics, And then later I'm trying to tell you about rubber hand illusions. What is all that even? It's a simple procedure that makes people feel like a fake rubber hand is actually their hand. And the way it works is that, in theory at least, but this makes a lot of sense, everyone pretty much agrees that the way it works is that it creates a consistency between the visual sensory input and the touch sensory input, and the brain detects this consistency, and in the absence of any other information, it uses that as its main guide, and so it restructures its map of the extent of the physical body to line these things up. There's been a lot of interest in this too. The number of publications has been going up rapidly. Here's what it looks like. Did I do this right? Oops, go back. So I built all this equipment for it. I built these machines to do the brushing automatically. You can see it here. We ended up not using the machines because Meow on the team did an experiment and directly compared the robotic versus manual brushing and showed that it actually works better to do it manually. Probably spent more time in the shop than I really should have building those things. But this part was important because, so here's what it really looks like with a human doing the brushing. This is an overhead view, so you can see that what's going on here is that this is the person's real hand, and they're sitting over here, and then because of this barricade, they can't see their real hand. They just see the rubber hand, and then in a second, where did I miss it? We used a procedure from Botvinnik and Cohen where it bends the finger back. So I built a machine to bend the finger back automatically so it would be controlled by the computer sequencing, actually controlled by an iPad app that Andy wrote. Anyway, so yeah, I'm sorry if I feel a little uncomfortable here. It's hard for me to stop myself from just like going on and into great detail about the rubber hand illusion. You can ask me questions later. Anyway, moving forward. With the synchronous brushing, the visual and the tactile line up. You can see the brushes were moving together. The brain adjusts the body map to match. And in a lot of the literature as a control condition, they use asynchronous brushing, where the brushes are not moving together. They don't line up. And it's fairly well established in the literature that when you do it that way, the brain doesn't readjust the body map. So we use that as a control condition too. This is, oh, I forgot to mention, you could see in those pictures that there were skin conductance electrodes on the other hand. So we're collecting self-report at the end of each trial. There's brushing, and then did you feel it? And we're also collecting the skin conductance data all the way through. So these are all the traces of skin conductance data from every trial, from every subject. What you can see is that consistently everybody responds to the bend. The bend is actually pretty little disturbing. It's pretty startling. So people have a strong skin conductance response there. And what you can see in the bottom one is that, so red is synchronous, and by the end, these are mean-centered, which is why it all crosses in the middle. But overall, the red is above the blue by the time you get to the end. So people are having higher level of skin conductance and a higher response to the finger bend stimulus for synchronous rather than asynchronous. So that replicates what's in the literature. That's what's supposed to happen. And I'm going to refer to that difference as the effect of the rubber hand illusion in all the measures. So there's a strong RHI effect in the self-report, as you would expect. A very, very completely unambiguous difference overall across the groups, although not everyone actually reported feeling it, but most people did. And there's an effect in the skin conductance before the finger bend. Interestingly, I didn't see the effect in that peak after the finger bend. I'm still working on figuring out how to completely assemble this into a narrative. But there's a pretty unambiguous, strong difference between the synchronous and asynchronous conditions just in the last maybe 15 seconds or so before the bend. I kind of think maybe what's happening is that the bend, in our case, maybe because of the robot, it's just too disturbing and it takes people out of the illusion. but the skin conductance response that people are having up to that point after the brushing has been going on for a while is enough to give them some sort of response, which we can pick up in the physiology.
Dave, just to clarify, these are T's between asynchronous and asynchronous conditions, correct?
Yes. That's what I meant. How whenever, the RHI effect always refers to synchronous versus asynchronous. So, adding to that, the difference, the RHI effect, synchronous versus asynchronous, after the bend, is not related to the Are You the Same scale, or really much of anything else, actually. But it is significantly related to the Are You the Same scale, which is what I was hoping for. The other, so like I said, the after bend is not significantly related to the Are You the Same scale. Another part that I'm still trying to figure out what to make of it is that the self-report doesn't correlate well with the Are You the Same scale. There's a lot of reasons why a physiological measure might be giving you a better indication of something going on underneath the surface. I can't really make that claim yet with the data that I have so far, but I think it's promising. Just to back that up, this is the whole time sequence. Well, not the whole time sequence, because it's 90 seconds long. So I'm looking at basically the last half of the time sequence. This is where the bend is. So the top one there is just the amount of skin conductance response, and the fact that it's centered on 0, the way that these graphs are made, the fact that it's centered on 0 means that the biggest response, just overall, is at the time of the bend. And when you look at the significance of the relationship with the Are You the Same scale, that's sort of peaking before this bend, and then these are 10-second windows, so it's starting to fade when the windows are getting into the bend period. And that supports my idea that it's kind of killing the illusion effect. And then also, the difference with that test of the significance of just the difference between the synchronous and asynchronous conditions in the skin conductance is also peaking before the bend, and it's also fading when you get to after the bend. So that's why I think that this means what I hope for it to mean. I'm trying to walk a fine line here between saying how excited I am that this all worked out, but also, further studies are needed. So, I'm pretty excited though, because I think it did what I wanted it to do. So, I have the 3 studies together here. There's the AYTS looked at the narrative self. The endowment effect looked at physical object ownership, agency, and control in some sense. And study 3 looked at the self in terms of the body map using the rubber hand illusion. And I think that it's telling the story that's very consistent with the model that I was working with here. The Are You the Same scale, which has the face validity, has tied all these 3 things together. The nomological network for the Are You the Same scale, I think, is pretty well established by these studies. So there's sort of there's 2 things that are important about this. One of them is that the Are You the Same scale could play that role of that key that I said I was looking for before to use in other studies to tie things together. And the other one is that it's just really interesting that these things relate to each other. I mean, I don't think anybody before now would have ever said that they thought that you could actually measure some sort of correlation that would involve both the endowment effect and the rubber hand illusion. I mean, I think that probably sounds crazy to people who haven't gone through the whole step-by-step reasons. So, so anyway, I think it's pretty exciting. I'm trying to contain myself here. Anyway, so future directions. Like I said, the Are You the Same scale is now this questionnaire that I think could work really well and be used in all kinds of studies that we want to do here. For instance, going back to the effects of meditation on the neural response to pain, how much time do I have in terms of how much detail I can explain of why I think this would be a useful future direction?
Not more than 5 minutes.
Okay, well, just very briefly, pain, the pain is modeled as a homeostatic process where the brain is detecting a threat to the integrity of the organism, where it has this model of the self, and it's comparing things against that. So if the pain processing, in terms of if the cognitive and neural processes going on in the brain overlap with the ones in this nomological network that I just established, then the Are You the Same scale could be really useful for figuring out which of the meditation practitioners have had the kinds of changes that you would expect to lead to the changes in pain response in the brain, and which of them are at the other end of the scale. And then there's a whole background here that's not my research that's been, I think, really important in this lab, where we look at the lifetime hours of practice, and we start to see really interesting effects where maybe you don't see a group difference between the American long-term meditation practitioners versus novices, but then when you start looking at it in more detail and finer factors to tell you something about exactly how advanced their practice are, then you start to see really strong effects that indicate the kinds of things that we've been looking for and have supported a lot of our hypotheses. So I think this could really contribute to that process. And another thing, this is kind of a long shot, but this was all a long shot, so I'm just going to throw it out there. I think it could be very interesting to use the Are You the Same scale in studies of meditation on the immune system, because the immune system is generally characterized at a biological level of having to do with this sort of map of the chemical and biological self. And there's also a lot of evidence now which is involved in man, my throat is, this is a long talk. I don't usually give talks this long. Gonna have to practice that. Or, I don't know. Melissa Rosenkrantz here does a lot of work on interactions between meditation and the immune system, and it's pretty well established that the immune system is heavily influenced by central nervous system effects. So we already have a sense that the immune system has something to do with some dimension of self on some level, if you're willing to stretch your way of thinking about that to include a purely biological, like cellular surface signaling, self versus other kind of detection. And we know it's connected to the central nervous system. So it would be super interesting if the cognitive processing of identifying the boundaries of the self also ended up relating to those immune responses. So who knows? I don't know if that, it's a long shot, but it's a thing that is potentially a tractable question to address now, and I don't think it was before the work I did. So, in conclusion, I discussed models of how the brain processes the sense of self. I guess, to be honest, I mostly discuss models of how the mind processes the sense of self. I talked about why this is relevant to a few different kinds of research with translational outcomes. I developed a promising measure. I showed its nomological network validity, developed some novel techniques like the Weiser bidding procedure, and I showed that some things were related to things that you probably wouldn't have otherwise expected. I don't really know how to make that sound like a formal thing, but it just seems cool to me. Anyway, so I want to give a lot of thanks to all the people who worked with me on the Equal team. In case you hadn't already noticed, I really, really appreciate the people I work with. It's just been, I've never had the opportunity before grad school to work with a team like that, and it's just been so rewarding. I mean, it really meant so much to me. The Davidson Lab community, the people here, a lot of you, just, to be in a place and around people who share so many common interests with me and are all, this place kind of filters for people who want to be kind, which makes it a really, really nice environment to know the people in. The wider community of contemplative scientists, like I said, the Mind and Life Institute, stuff like that. There are people here that I met through the wider community and I knew for years, and now they're here, and some of them are here in this room right now, which is pretty cool. My committee, I really want to give a lot of thanks to my committee. My committee is really a lot more than just a PhD committee. Antoine, who, me and Antoine, the men in black in that picture, we're traveling through India together and getting sick and doing all this crazy stuff and getting off the middle of the night and buying things that turned out to not be what we thought they were. Awful. Pictures of me with John Dunn from so long ago. It's funny, John is actually the very first person I met in this community because of a conference I went to in 2005. So, and then of course I want to thank Richie for taking a chance on me, because it's one thing to be really interested in something, and I was out of academia for a while, and then I came back into academia, and I knew a lot of people who were just like, yeah, I like to think about interesting things. And at some point I was like, I'm going to sit around having, conversations over dinner with my friends about interesting things, and then maybe we hear about something interesting did, but I want to be where they're figuring out the interesting stuff. And that's not really very easy. My friend, I had another friend who had gone back into academia with much stronger credentials that I had. And he told me a lot about how hard it was to do that and how unlikely of a transition it was to make. So it was a big gamble, and there's been some ups and downs and twists and turns and stuff like that, but I'm really happy to be here right now. So thank you. Delta R squared is, I think I might have too much adrenaline in my system right now to completely explain in fine detail exactly which one it is among all the different effect size measures. I know that it's synonymous with partial eta squared. The numbers that I was using were, some of the numbers I was using were reported by the model effect sizes function in the LM support package, which is maintained by our own John Curtin. Some of the numbers I calculated from scratch from the, this is the part where I'd have to go back and look at my code. But you could calculate it from the, if you have a linear model and you have, however many predictors, and you want the delta R squared for this one, I think what it was that you take this one and you model it against these, and you take the residual, and then you do the zero order correlation between this one and this one, and then yeah, there's a bunch of different ways of doing that. And is Jeanette here? Jeanette's not here. Yeah, Jeanette basically told me effect sizes suck. Just report the delta R squared, because at least it's obvious what that means. Oh, right. And the reason she said it was obvious what it meant is that what it is it's the change in the overall model R squared if you take that one regressor out. That's what I was looking for, yeah.
Other questions?
That fitting procedure for the endowment effect, can you explain that pretty quickly, or is it really complicated?
Oh man, it's super complicated.
Don't worry about that.
In fact, I think one of the things that was the biggest obstacle with this study was I think the subjects were confused because there's a lot of noise in those data. There's way more noise in the output of the physical bids. And in fact, in the paper that I wrote, I had a discussion of, one thing that we could do that would basically two things that would be important. One of them is use a lot more goods and basically just do a bunch of more trials to try to get the noise level down. And then the other thing is to just try to figure out how to explain it better. The short version is that this incentive compatible thing refers to a whole class of, it's a trick that you see a lot in the behavioral economics literature, where you ask people a bunch of questions about a bunch of things, and you tell them at the end that we'll roll the dice or flip a coin, or the computer will pick a random number, and only one of them will end up being real, but you don't know which one is going to be real, so you have to take all of them seriously. So what we did is we started with 2 items, and we basically told them, you need to bid to buy both of them. One of them will be a real bid and the other one won't, but you don't know in advance because we're going to flip a coin. Well, we didn't flip a coin. It's true they didn't know in advance, but we knew in advance which one was going to be. So we get both their values, and then one of them, we're like, all right, this is the real auction. So then we run it, and if they bid high enough for to win the auction, then they get it, or they don't. Now the problem with that is that first of all, they're thinking about this value a lot because there's the whole auction procedure, and did I buy it? Did I not buy it? How much did I spend? Blah, blah, blah. So the other one we say, all right, that was a fake auction. We're actually just going to give you that one. Thanks for playing. So then we take some time, we do all the, half an hour worth of other questionnaires. And now we have this thing where everybody has this one. The other one, everybody doesn't have that because maybe they won the auction, maybe they didn't win the auction. But this one, we have their bid. They're not thinking too much about the bid because we told them it was a fake auction. And they have the object. So then at the end, now we do another auction to see how much they want to sell it for. And that's how we get the buying and the selling values for the same thing, while trying to minimize, you can never completely eliminate the effect of one number on another number that people are thinking about. But we try to at least minimize that effect with the structure of the system. I'm hoping that you're just asking a question about why I decided to draw the figure that way for aesthetic reasons, but I'm gonna maybe assume that maybe there's a deeper meaning to that question, and I'm just gonna come right out and admit that when I directly tested, I didn't write a paper about the relationship between the endowment effect and the rubber hand illusion. It was sort of like using the Are You the Same scale as this probe for these different phenomena. I did a quick and dirty test and I didn't find a significant relationship, but since then I figured out that there were problems with the way I was actually, the first way that I had processed the loss aversion figures from the different economic paradigms wasn't the right way to do it. And my p-values on everything improved when I did it the way the literature said I was supposed to do it, so I have to go back and look at that. It may be related, but I can't promise anything right now.
Maybe one last question.
This may be silly, but what's the healthiest Are You the Same score?
Do you mean like specifically which person had it, or like what would be the...
Should I not think I'm the same moment to moment?
That's a super interesting question, because the answer is probably that it should be somewhere in the middle. The real answer is probably that it should be somewhere in the middle. It sort of depends on what you mean by healthy, though. A whole thread that I left out of the story was all the conversations I had with Willoughby Britton, for one, and a bunch of other people who does research on people. She does research on people who have bad effects of meditation, and they kind of go crazy because they dissolve their sense of self too much, and then they can't deal with their stuff. And it's not entire. First of all, she says if you actually look in the Theravadan Buddhist literature, the thing that's happening to them is pretty well documented. It doesn't seem surprising at all. But of course, that literature isn't really written from the point of view of like, improve your work performance. That like the Theravadan Buddhist literature is like, well, like go out into the forest, forgo all worldly attachments, abandon your family, forget about everything, and then if you do all this meditation and you feel kind of crazy for a while, and that's part of the past, then like that's okay. Like there's not really, you can't really fundamentally evaluate good or bad without some standard to evaluate it against. From a Western point of view, I would say that you're going to have a hard time functioning in society if you're too low on the scale. And I could show you, I don't think there's really time, but afterwards let me show you something. There was a free-form response part, and there was this one really heartbreaking response where this person just looked, they wrote this whole essay about how awful their life was and how they're homeless and like hearing voices and all this kind of stuff. And they're like, yeah, I don't think I'm the same from one second to another. So it was like this very clear example of someone where they really just didn't have enough of that solidity. The theory is that normal people who are kind of just like holding down jobs in their regular study population are probably in the part of the scale where they have enough solidity, and then having less might help with other qualities. Gina.
Follow up, did you measure, and if not, if you could put that to some research, that's, for example, psychological well-being or trait measures of mood to see if they are really matters?
So I have we did the PANAS now all the time. We did like so many PANAS nows with the people, and there's really not a lot of relationships of that with the Are You the Same scale in our data set. Of course, that's just a state measure, not a trait measure. I did have, some of the people did the psychological well-being scale, but they did it at time 2, and I think that we had some problems with the time 2 data where people were, I think there was, not that we ever do this here, but maybe there was a little too high of participant burden for people in some of the studies, because there's like the rubber hand illusion and the endowment effect, and it's like, can you figure out these complicated instructions? And like, so a lot of the measures were more noisy at time 2, and because of time constraints, we had one batch of questionnaires at time 1 and another batch at time 2, because we didn't want test-retest reliability for everything, and we didn't anticipate how low the return rate would be. So I only have the PWBS at time 2, and I didn't see any significant relationships with anything, but I don't take that as being conclusive for all those reasons I just said.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dave.
Thank you all.